On the morning of May 3rd, 1915, a man stepped out of a hole in the ground and saw something impossible. His name was John McCrae. He was a Canadian doctor, 42 years old, and he was standing on the edge of hell. Behind him, carved into the muddy bank of a canal in Belgium, was a field hospital, a series of concrete bunkers where he had just spent another night trying to save boys who were already dying. His uniform was stiff with dried blood, not his own blood. The blood of British and Canadian soldiers, torn apart by German artillery, carried to him on stretchers through the endless, sucking mud of the Western Front. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. The guns never stopped. Even now, in the pale dawn light, he could hear them. A constant, distant thunder that made the ground tremble beneath his feet. The sound had been going on for so long that silence would have felt strange, unnatural, like the world had stopped spinning. Yesterday, he had buried his best friend, Lieutenant Alexis Helmer, 22 years old, a brilliant young officer, a former student who had become like a son to McCrae. Helmer had been killed instantly when a German shell landed directly on his artillery position. There wasn't much left to bury, just enough to wrap in a blanket and lower into a grave, scraped out of the Flanders clay, a few yards from where McCrae now stood. McCrae had performed the funeral service himself. There was no chaplain available, too many dead, not enough priests. So he had read from the Book of Common Prayer, his voice steady and professional, while inside he screamed. They had placed a rough wooden cross over the grave and moved on, because there were more wounded arriving, more boys dying, and grief was a luxury no one could afford. Now, in the grey morning light, McCrae looked toward the place where his friend lay buried, and he saw them. Red flowers, thousands of them, tens of thousands. Bright scarlet poppies growing across the battlefield like drops of blood scattered on grey cloth. They were growing in the shell craters. They were growing between the graves, between the white wooden crosses that marked the resting places of the dead. They were growing on Alexis Helmer's fresh grave, already beginning to cover the disturbed earth with living colour. How was this possible? This place was a moonscape. The constant artillery had reduced the landscape to a wasteland of mud, water-filled craters, and shattered tree stumps. Nothing should be alive here. The birds had fled years ago. The grass was gone. Even the rats and lice seemed like they were too good for this place, too evolved to endure what the humans were inflicting on each other. And yet these flowers, these delicate, paper-thin red flowers, were blooming as if this were a garden and not a graveyard. McCrae stood very still, staring at the poppies. The contrast was overwhelming. The grey mud, the grey sky, the grey faces of exhausted soldiers, and these impossibly bright flowers, red as arterial blood, growing between the crosses that marked where young men had been buried just days, sometimes hours before. There was something terrible and beautiful about it. Nature, indifferent to human suffering, simply doing what it had always done. Seeds buried in the soil for decades, perhaps centuries, suddenly given the conditions they needed, disturbed earth, exposed to light, and exploding into bloom. The more death, the more life. The more shells fell and churned the ground, the more poppies grew. It was a message, though McCrae didn't know from whom or what. A reminder that the earth would reclaim this place eventually, that the war was a temporary madness, that life would insist on itself no matter how hard men tried to destroy it. He looked at those red flowers growing on his friend's grave, and something broke open inside him. Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, not just the wars, but the small human moments within them, the grief and beauty that emerge from horror, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows where history hides its most important truths. Tonight, we will follow a flower from a battlefield to the world. We will trace how one exhausted doctor's 20-minute poem became a global movement, how a French schoolteacher and an American professor turned grief into action, how a symbol of peace became a weapon in culture wars, and how a delicate red flower came to carry the weight of over 100 million dead. This is not just the story of a flower. This is the story of how we choose to remember war, how we honor the fallen, how we turn private grief into public ritual, and how even the most beautiful symbols can be twisted by the living, pulled apart by politics until they mean everything and nothing at the same time. This is the story of the poppy, and it begins in hell. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand the flower, you must first understand the field where it grew. And to understand the field, you must understand the war that created it. So, let us go back. Back to the summer of 1914, when the world stumbled into the most catastrophic conflict in human history. John McCrae was 41 years old when the war began. He was a respected physician in Montreal, a published poet, a man of education and culture. He had served as a soldier before, in the Second Boer War in South Africa at the turn of the century. But that had been a colonial war, fought in open spaces under a hot sun, a war that seemed almost gentlemanly compared to what was coming. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, Canada, as part of the British Empire, was automatically at war as well. McCrae didn't have to volunteer. He was too old, too valuable as a civilian doctor, too established in his career to throw it away for a war that everyone said would be over by Christmas. But he volunteered anyway. He believed in duty. He believed in the British Empire and its civilizing mission. He believed that when your country called, you answered. And perhaps, somewhere deep down, he believed that this war would be like the last one. Difficult, yes, but survivable. An adventure, even. A chance to serve something larger than himself. He had no idea what he was volunteering for. By the spring of 1915, the war had transformed into something no one had anticipated. The Western Front, a 450-mile wound stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, had become a stalemate of trenches, barbed wire, and industrialized slaughter. New weapons had turned warfare into a science of death. Machine guns could fire 600 rounds per minute, mowing down advancing soldiers like wheat before a scythe. Artillery shells the size of a man could obliterate anything within 100 yards. Poison gas rolled across no man's land, turning men's lungs into liquid. And the generals, trained in the cavalry charges and bayonet tactics of the previous century, kept sending men forward in waves, straight into this machinery of death, believing that enough bodies thrown at the problem would eventually break through. They were wrong, but they kept trying. In April 1915, John McCrae arrived at the Ypres salient in Belgium. The salient was a bulge in the Allied lines, surrounded on three sides by German positions. German artillery could hit it from multiple directions, making it one of the deadliest places on the Western Front. It was a killing ground, and everyone knew it. The landscape McCrae saw when he arrived was like something from a nightmare. This had once been Belgian farmland. Rolling fields, small villages, churches with medieval spires. Now there was nothing. Trees had been reduced to blackened stumps. Buildings were piles of rubble. The earth itself looked wounded, covered in thousands of shell craters that filled with water and turned into stinking pools. The mud was the worst part. Flanders clay, mixed with rain, blood, and the liquefied remains of the dead, created a thick, sucking morass that could swallow a man whole. Soldiers drowned in shell craters. Wounded men, too weak to pull themselves free, simply sank into the mud and disappeared. And over all of it hung the smell of rotting flesh, human and horse, the smell of poison gas, the smell of cordite from millions of shells, the smell of the latrine trenches that couldn't be properly maintained because anyone who tried to dig in daylight would be shot by snipers. It was a smell that got into your clothes, your hair, your lungs, until you couldn't remember what clean air smelled like. This was the world John McCrae entered in the spring of 1915. McCrae was assigned to the Essex Farm Advanced Dressing Station, a field hospital on the bank of the Yser Canal just north of Ypres. The hospital was a series of concrete bunkers dug into the canal bank, reinforced with timber and sandbags. It was underground, dark, damp, and cold. Even in the middle of the day, you needed candles and oil lamps to see. The bunkers were connected by narrow trenches, which meant that anyone moving between them was exposed to German artillery and sniper fire. The Germans knew where the dressing stations were. They could see the medical markings, but that didn't stop them from shelling the area, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. McCrae's job was triage. The wounded arrived in waves, carried on stretchers by exhausted bearers, who had hauled them through miles of trenches and across open ground while shells exploded around them. The men who arrived at Essex Farm were the ones who had been judged stable enough to survive the journey. Many others died in the trenches or at the battalion aid posts closer to the front, never making it this far. When the stretchers arrived, McCrae had to make rapid decisions. This man's leg could be saved. Send him to surgery. This one had a sucking chest wound. Probably won't survive, but try. This one had been hit in the abdomen by shrapnel. His intestines were shredded. Nothing to be done. Give him morphine and let him die as comfortably as possible. These were the decisions McCrae made dozens of times a day, sometimes hundreds of times, when a major battle was underway and the casualties flooded in faster than the doctors could process them. And he was good at his job. He was a skilled surgeon, calm under pressure, able to work for 20 hours straight when necessary. His hands didn't shake. His judgment didn't falter. He could set bones, extract bullets, tie off arteries, amputate limbs when there was no other choice. But even the best surgeon in the world couldn't fix what modern weapons did to the human body. High explosive shells didn't create the neat bullet holes of previous wars. They created wounds that looked like something from a slaughterhouse. Shrapnel didn't just pierce flesh, it shredded it, turned organs into hamburger, left wounds so extensive that there was simply too much damage to repair. And the gas, the poison gas, was something new, something that felt like a violation of every rule of warfare, every standard of civilization. Men would arrive at the dressing station choking, gasping, their lungs dissolving from the inside. Their skin would blister. They would cough up pieces of their own lung tissue. and McCrae could do nothing but watch them drown in their own fluids, because there was no treatment, no cure, nothing but morphine and the hope that death would come quickly. This was John McCrae's life in the spring of 1915, day after day, night after night, trying to save boys who were 19, 20, 21 years old. Boys who should have been in university or working on farms or courting girls, but who instead were dying in his bunker, crying for their mothers, asking if they were going to be all right, and McCrae having to lie and say yes, yes, you'll be fine, even as he watched the light go out of their eyes. The psychological weight of it was crushing. But you couldn't break down, couldn't afford to feel, because if you started feeling, you wouldn't be able to function. And if you couldn't function, more men would die. So you built walls in your mind. You turned off the part of yourself that felt empathy. You focused on the technical problem in front of you. This artery needs to be clamped. This bone needs to be set. And you didn't think about the person attached to the body, the mother back home who would receive a telegram, the life that was being snuffed out on your operating table. You became a machine. It was the only way to survive. But even machines have breaking points. In late April 1915, McCrae received news that an old friend was being posted nearby. Lieutenant Alexis Helmer, a young artillery officer, would be stationed with his battery just a few miles from Essex Farm. This news lifted McCrae's spirits in a way that surprised him. He hadn't realized how isolated he'd become, how much he'd retreated into himself. Having someone to talk to, someone who knew him from before the war, someone who could remind him that there was a world beyond the mud and blood. It felt like being thrown a lifeline. Alexis Helmer was 22 years old. He had been McCrae's student at McGill University in Montreal, one of those bright, enthusiastic young men who made teaching a joy. He was from a good family, well-educated, fluent in French and English, exactly the kind of young officer the Canadian Expeditionary Force prized. The war had been good to Helmer, relatively speaking. He had survived the early battles of 1914 without injury, had been promoted, and seemed to handle the stress of combat better than most. He was optimistic, convinced that the Allies would break through eventually, that the war would end in victory, that they would all go home and tell stories about their great adventure. McCrae knew better. He'd seen too much. But he didn't want to crush the young man's spirit, so he kept his darker thoughts to himself. When they met for dinner in a ruined farmhouse behind the lines, they talked about Montreal, about poetry, about Canadian politics, about anything except the war. These brief conversations were a form of escape, a way to pretend, for an hour or two, that they were normal people living normal lives, not participants in the largest slaughter in human history. On the evening of May 2nd, 1915, Helmer stopped by the dressing station to say hello. He and McCrae shared a tin of tobacco and talked about a poem Helmer was trying to write. Helmer was a decent poet, not great, but earnest. He showed McCrae a draft about the spring flowers beginning to bloom in the fields behind the lines. McCrae offered some suggestions, the kind of gentle criticism a professor gives a student. They laughed. They shook hands. Helmer returned to his battery, and McCrae went back to work. It was the last time they saw each other. The next morning, at dawn on May 3rd, the Germans opened up with a massive artillery bombardment. This was the prelude to the Second Battle of Ypres, one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire war. Thousands of shells fell on the Allied positions. The ground shook. The air filled with the scream of incoming projectiles and the thunder of explosions. Helmer's battery was hit directly. A German shell landed in the middle of the gun position. The explosion was so powerful that it obliterated everything within 20 feet. 3 men died instantly. Alexis Helmer was one of them. When the smoke cleared, there wasn't much left to identify. Just fragments, pieces. They collected what they could find, wrapped it in a blanket, and sent word to McCrae. The body, what remained of it, arrived at Essex Farm that afternoon. McCrae had to look at it, had to confirm the identity. This was part of his job, another grim duty in a war full of them. He stood over the blanket-wrapped remains and tried to find something, anything, that would tell him this had been his friend, his student, the bright young man he had been talking to just yesterday. He found a ring, a signet ring Helmer always wore. That was enough. Yes, McCrae said, that's Alexis. There was no time for grief. There were wounded arriving from the bombardment, men who could still be saved. McCrae returned to work, his hands covered in his friend's blood, and he operated on stranger after stranger, while Alexis Helmer's body lay in a corner of the bunker, waiting for burial. They buried Helmer the next morning, May 3rd. There was no elaborate funeral, no honor guard, no flag-draped coffin, just a rough wooden cross, a grave dug in the mud, and a handful of soldiers standing in the rain while John McCrae read from the Book of Common Prayer. The cemetery was just yards from the dressing station. The graves were packed tightly together, row upon row of white wooden crosses marking where boys were buried. The cemetery was growing every day. Soon it would have hundreds of graves, eventually thousands. McCrae read the words, I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. His voice was steady. He had done this before, too many times. But this time was different. This time it was personal. They lowered Helmer into the ground. Not even in a proper coffin. There weren't enough coffins, just wrapped in a blanket and a canvas tarp. The grave was shallow, only 3 feet deep, because digging deeper risked hitting groundwater. And besides, who had time to dig deeper when there were more bodies arriving every day? They filled in the grave, placed the cross. Someone said a prayer, and then everyone dispersed because work didn't stop. The war didn't stop. And standing still too long in the open made you a target for German snipers. McCrae returned to his bunker. He had work to do. More wounded were arriving. He pulled on his surgical apron, still stained with Helmer's blood, and went back to work. But that night he couldn't sleep. He sat in the bunker, listening to the distant guns, and thought about Alexis Helmer, about all the young men he'd watched die, about the sheer waste of it all, the stupidity, the futility. And he thought, someone needs to remember, someone needs to say their names, to witness what happened here, to make sure the world knows that these weren't just numbers in a casualty report. They were people, they were alive, and now they're not. On the morning of May the 3rd, after a sleepless night, John McCrae stepped out of the bunker for some air. The dawn was grey and cold. The smell of cordite still hung in the air from yesterday's bombardment. The guns had quieted, a temporary lull before the next assault. And in that brief moment of relative peace, McCrae looked toward the cemetery where he had buried his friend. And he saw them, red poppies, thousands of them. A sea of scarlet covering the battlefield like a tide of blood. They were growing everywhere, in the shell craters, along the edges of the trenches, and most strikingly, in the cemetery itself. growing between the white wooden crosses that mark the graves of the dead. On Alexis Helmer's grave, freshly dug just yesterday, red poppies were already beginning to bloom, bright, vivid red against the grey mud. Life sprouting from death. How? McCrae was a doctor, a man of science. He knew that poppies, papaverrhoias, the common red-field poppy, could lie dormant in soil for decades, even centuries. Their seeds could wait in the ground, patient and silent, until the right conditions appeared. They needed light. They needed disturbed earth. They needed alkaline soil. The war was giving them all three. The constant shelling was churning the earth, turning over soil that hadn't been exposed to sunlight in generations. The explosions were breaking open buildings, releasing lime from shattered mortar and concrete, neutralizing the naturally acidic Flanders clay. And the devastation had removed all competing vegetation. No grass, no trees, nothing to block the sun. The battlefield had become a perfect growing environment for poppies. The more death, the more destruction, the more the flowers bloomed. It was nature's dark joke. Mankind's most advanced technology of destruction was creating ideal conditions for one of nature's most delicate flowers. But McCrae wasn't thinking about the science in that moment. He was thinking about the symbolism, the meaning, the terrible beauty of red flowers, red as blood, red as the poppies on the hillsides of his Canadian childhood, growing on the graves of the dead. The poppies looked like they were growing from the bodies themselves, fed by the blood that had soaked into the soil. They looked like the souls of the dead, refusing to be silenced, insisting on being seen. McCrae stood there, staring at those red flowers growing on his friend's grave, and something crystallized in his mind, an image, a feeling, a truth that needed to be put into words. He turned and walked back into the bunker. In the back of an ambulance, in the dim light of a candle, John McCrae sat down with a piece of paper. His hands were still stained with blood. He could never quite get it all off, no matter how hard he scrubbed. His uniform was filthy. He was exhausted, running on caffeine and adrenaline, and the desperate need to do something, anything, to make sense of what he'd witnessed. And he wrote. The poem came quickly, almost automatically, as if something else was writing through him. 20 minutes, maybe less. 3 stanzas, 15 lines, simple words, simple rhythm, nothing fancy, nothing elaborate, just the truth of what he'd seen. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing. Fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. McCrae read it over once. Then he read it aloud to another officer who was nearby, Colonel Morrison. Morrison listened in silence. When McCrae finished, He looked up and said simply, "That's good." "You should send it somewhere." McCrae shrugged. He wasn't sure. It felt too raw, too personal, too simple, maybe, to capture the enormity of what was happening. He crumpled up the paper and tossed it aside. Morrison retrieved it from the mud. "No, seriously, it's good." McCrae didn't argue. He was too tired to argue. He tucked the poem into his pocket and went back to work, because more wounded were arriving, and the war didn't stop for poetry. A few weeks later, he sent it to a magazine in London called The Spectator. They rejected it. Then he sent it to Punch, a humour and literary magazine. They accepted it. On December 8th, 1915, In Flanders Fields, was published in Punch. Within weeks, it was the most famous poem in the English-speaking world. Newspapers reprinted it. Soldiers carried copies in their pockets. Families clipped it from the pages and kept it on their mantelpieces. It was read at funerals, at memorial services, at ceremonies honouring the dead. It was translated into French, German, Italian. It crossed oceans, crossed trenches, crossed the lines that divided the living from the dead. Why? What made this particular poem resonate when thousands of other war poems were being written and forgotten? Perhaps it was the voice. The poem speaks not as an observer, but as the dead themselves. We are the dead, not they or the fallen or some abstract concept. We. First person plural, the voice of ghosts, speaking directly to the living, refusing to be forgotten. Perhaps it was the image, the poppies growing between the crosses, visual, immediate, specific. You could see it in your mind. You could picture the red flowers on the grey battlefield, could understand the contrast, the terrible beauty. Perhaps it was the demand. Take up our quarrel with the foe. The dead weren't asking to be mourned. They were demanding that the living continue the fight, that their sacrifice not be in vain. For a world at war, still believing the conflict was necessary and just, this message was powerful. The dead were giving permission to keep fighting. Or perhaps it was simply this: the poem told the truth. It didn't glorify war. It didn't pretend death was noble or beautiful. It acknowledged the horror. We are the dead, while also acknowledging the duty that the living felt to the fallen. It gave voice to both grief and resolve, both loss and purpose. John McCrae had captured something essential about war and memory in 15 simple lines, and the world recognized it immediately. But McCrae himself never saw what his poem would become. For 3 more years, he continued working in field hospitals, trying to save men who were dying faster than he could treat them. He worked through exhaustion, through illness, through the crushing psychological weight of witnessing endless death. And in January 1918, just 10 months before the war ended, his body gave out. He contracted pneumonia, which developed into meningitis. On January 28, 1918, at a military hospital in Boulogne, France, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae died. He was 45 years old. They buried him with full military honours at Wimereux Cemetery in France. His grave was marked with a white cross, just like the crosses he had seen covering the fields of Flanders. And in the spring, red poppies grew on his grave. But the poem he had written in 20 minutes, in the back of an ambulance, while covered in his friend's blood, was just beginning its journey. Across the Atlantic Ocean, In a YMCA office in New York City, a 49-year-old professor was about to read those 15 lines, and she would change everything. November 11th, 1918, 11 a.m. Across the Western Front, the guns fell silent. For 4 years, 1 month and 1 week, the artillery had never stopped. The sound of shelling had become so constant that men could no longer imagine silence. It was the background noise of existence, the heartbeat of the war. You slept through it. You woke to it. You learned to judge the danger of a shell by its sound. The whistle of incoming fire, the scream of its descent, the thunderous crash of impact. And then, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, it stopped. The Armistice had been signed that morning in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne. At precisely 11 a.m., all fighting on the Western Front would cease. Word spread through the trenches via telegram, via runners, via shouted messages down the line. The war is over. Stand down. At 11 a.m., the last shots were fired, and then nothing. Silence. Men stood in the trenches, stunned. Some didn't believe it. They kept their heads down, waiting for the next barrage. Others climbed up onto the parapet, something that would have been suicide just seconds before, and stood in the open, marveling that no one was shooting at them. The silence was deafening. After 4 years of constant noise, the absence of sound felt wrong, unnatural. Some men started laughing, others started crying. Most just stood there, numb, trying to process what had just happened. They had survived. The war was over. They were going home. But the joy, when it came, was muted, tempered by exhaustion and trauma and the knowledge of what the war had cost. There were no wild celebrations in the trenches that day, just a strange, hollow relief, and the overwhelming sense that something fundamental had changed, that the world they were returning to was not the world they had left. The final death toll was still being calculated. It would take years to count all the bodies, to identify the missing, to tally the cost. But even the preliminary numbers were staggering. 10 million soldiers dead, 20 million wounded, 7 million civilians killed by disease, starvation, and violence. Entire villages wiped out, cities reduced to rubble, a generation of young men destroyed. It was the bloodiest conflict in human history. The war to end all wars, they were already calling it, because surely, mankind could never endure something like this again. The guns were silent, but the dying wasn't over. In 1919, as the survivors began to return home and the business of peace slowly, painfully began, journalists and officials were finally allowed to tour the Western Front without military supervision. What they saw shocked them, even though they thought they were prepared. The battlefield stretched for 450 miles, from the North Sea in Belgium to the Swiss border. The entire landscape had been transformed into something alien, something that looked like the surface of another planet. Forests that had stood for centuries were reduced to fields of broken stumps. Towns and villages had simply ceased to exist, not damaged, but erased, ground into dust and rubble by 4 years of constant shelling. The earth itself was wounded. Millions of shell craters, overlapping like a honeycomb, filled with stagnant water. In some places, the craters were so dense that there was no solid ground left, just a sea of mud and water stretching for miles. And buried in that mud were the remnants of the war. Unexploded shells by the millions, pieces of equipment, shards of metal and bone, and bodies. So many bodies. Some buried in marked graves, most not. The earth was full of the dead. It would take decades to clear the battlefield. In fact, even today, over a century later, farmers in Belgium and France still unearth shells and bones when they plough their fields. The war refuses to stay buried. But in the spring of 1919, something else was growing on those battlefields. Poppies. Red poppies, covering the landscape like a scarlet tide, growing in the shell craters, along the old trench lines, in the cemeteries where hundreds of thousands of white crosses marked the graves of the fallen. The poppies didn't care about nationality. They grew on British graves, Canadian graves, French graves, German graves. To the flowers, they were all just disturbed soil. Journalists photographed them, artists painted them, and people began to notice something remarkable. John McCrae's poem had predicted this. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row. He had seen it in 1915, when the war was barely halfway done, and now, in 1919, the image had become even more powerful, more universal. The poppy had become the visual symbol of the war. But it was still just a flower, a natural phenomenon. It hadn't yet become a symbol that people wore, a token of remembrance. That transformation would require human action. It would require grief to be channeled into purpose. And it would require two women on opposite sides of the Atlantic who refused to let the dead be forgotten. In 1919, the nations that had fought the war faced a profound problem. How do you remember 20 million dead? Individual funerals were impossible. The scale was too vast. Mass graves held thousands of bodies, most unidentified. The phrase, missing in action, appeared on casualty lists millions of times. Men who'd been blown to pieces, or buried in collapsed trenches, or simply swallowed by the mud, leaving behind no body, no grave, no physical proof they had ever existed beyond a name on a telegram sent to a grieving family. Monuments could be built, of course. The victorious nations would eventually construct elaborate memorials, walls inscribed with thousands of names, tombs for unknown soldiers, arches and obelisks and eternal flames. These would come, but they took time, years of planning and construction. In the meantime, people needed something, some way to mark their grief, some ritual or symbol that would acknowledge the loss without requiring them to articulate the unspeakable trauma they had endured. Traditional mourning rituals felt inadequate. Wearing black? For how long? Should a mother who lost her son wear black for the rest of her life? Should a widow mourn forever? What about a nation that had lost nearly 1 million men? Should the entire country dress in black for a decade? Something new was needed. Something that could be both personal and collective. Something that could honor the dead without demanding that grief be performed in a specific way. The answer was growing in the fields of Flanders, but it would take two remarkable women to recognize it and turn it into a global movement. The first was a schoolteacher from Georgia. The second was a widow from France. Neither had met. Neither knew the other existed. But both read John McCrae's poem, and both decided, independently, that the poppy was the answer. November 9th, 1918, New York City, Moina Belle. Michael sat in her office at the YMCA overseas headquarters, exhausted but unable to stop working. She was 49 years old, a professor from the University of Georgia who had volunteered for war work when America entered the conflict in 1917. Her official title was YMC, a war worker, but in practice, she was everything: coordinator, counselor, substitute mother to thousands of young American servicemen passing through New York on their way to the battlefields of Europe. For 18 months, she had watched them come through. Boys, really. 18, 19, 20 years old. Fresh-faced, excited, terrified, trying to be brave. She would help them find their units, answer their questions, write letters home for those who couldn't write, sit with them when they were scared, pray with them when they asked. And then they would ship out, crossing the Atlantic in overcrowded transports, heading toward the meat grinder of the Western Front. Some would come back. Most wouldn't. The casualty reports arrived daily, pages and pages of names, and sometimes Moina would see a name she recognized and remember the face, the boy who had asked her to help him mail a letter to his mother, or the young man who had showed her a photograph of his sweetheart back home. It was November 9th, 1918. Moina didn't know it yet, but the armistice would be signed in 2 days. The war was almost over. But sitting in her office that afternoon, surrounded by paperwork and the constant flow of servicemen, she had no reason to believe the nightmare would end anytime soon. She picked up a copy of the Ladies' Home Journal that someone had left on her desk. She needed a break, just a few minutes to think about something other than casualty reports and shipping manifests and the endless, grinding machinery of war. She flipped through the magazine, past advertisements for soap and fabric, past recipes and fashion advice, and came to the poetry section. And there it was. In Flanders Fields, by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. Moina had heard of the poem. Everyone had. It had been published 3 years earlier and had become famous almost immediately, but she had never actually sat down and read it carefully, never given it her full attention. Now, in the quiet of her office, with the sounds of Grand Central Terminal drifting through the windows, she read it. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row. She read slowly, taking in each line, and somewhere around the second stanza, "We are the dead." Something broke inside her. These weren't abstract casualties. These were the boys she'd been sending to Europe. These were the faces she saw every day, the ones who trusted her to help them navigate this terrifying experience. And they were dying in mud, dying in foreign fields, dying while calling for mothers who were thousands of miles away. She reached the final stanza. "Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields." Moina felt like the dead were speaking directly to her, not to humanity in general, not to the living as an abstract concept, but to her personally. Moina Belle Michael, sitting in an office in New York City, complicit in sending boys to their deaths. Take up our quarrel. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. If ye break faith with us who die. She grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. Her hand was shaking. She needed to respond, needed to answer, needed to make a promise that she would not break faith. The words came quickly, automatically, as if she were taking dictation from something outside herself. "Oh, you who sleep in Flanders Fields, sleep sweet, to rise anew. We caught the torch you threw, and holding high we keep the faith with all who died." We cherish, too, the poppy red that grows on fields where valor led. It seems to signal to the skies that blood of heroes never dies, but lends a luster to the red of the flower that blooms above the dead in Flanders Fields. And now the torch and poppy red we wear in honour of our dead. Fear not that ye have died for naught. We'll teach the lesson that ye wrought in Flanders Fields. She signed it. We shall keep the faith. Moina stared at what she'd written. It wasn't great poetry, she knew that. It was clumsy in places, overly sentimental, but it was sincere. It was a vow, made to the dead, that she would remember them, that she would honour them. But how? Words weren't enough. Writing a response poem and filing it away in a drawer wasn't enough. There needed to be something physical, something visible, something that would allow her to keep her promise in a way that others could see. And now, the torch and poppy red we wear in honour of our dead. She had written it. Now she needed to do it. Moina looked around her office as if seeing it for the first time. What could she use as a poppy? She didn't have any. She didn't even have red fabric or paper. How could she? Wait. There was a woman downstairs, in the lobby of the building. An older woman who sold artificial flowers to passers-by. Moina had seen her dozens of times, never paid much attention. Just another war widow trying to make a living selling silk roses and daisies to people who wanted to brighten up their apartments. Moina grabbed her purse. She had $10, her spending money for the next 2 weeks. She ran downstairs, half afraid the flower seller would be gone. She was still there. The old woman looked up as Moina approached, slightly startled by the intensity in the younger woman's eyes. "Do you have any red flowers?" Moina asked breathlessly. The woman looked down at her basket. "I have roses." "And some poppies, yes. Artificial silk poppies." "I'll take all of them." The woman blinked. "All of them? Every single one. How many do you have?" The woman counted. 25, dear. But they're 25 cents each. That's... Here. Moina thrust the $10 at her. "Take it." "I need them all." The woman carefully counted out 25 small silk poppies, cheap things really, meant as decorative flowers for hats or dresses, simple red petals around a black centre. Nothing fancy, but to Moina, in that moment, they were sacred objects. She gathered them in her arms and rushed back upstairs to her office. Several servicemen were waiting there, young soldiers needing help with paperwork or looking for directions. They looked at Moina curiously as she came in, clutching an armful of red flowers. Moina set the flowers on her desk. Her hands were still shaking. She picked up one poppy and pinned it to her own jacket, right over her heart. Then she turned to the soldiers. "Wear this," she said, holding out a flower to the nearest young man. "For the boys who won't come home." The soldier looked at the flower, then at Moina's face. He saw she was crying. He took the poppy carefully, as if it were made of glass, and pinned it to his uniform. "For the boys who won't come home," he repeated quietly. Moina moved to the next soldier, then the next. Within minutes, every poppy was gone. Every soldier in the room was wearing a red flower on his chest. Some of them were crying now too. All of them understood what the flower meant. The symbol was so simple, so obvious, that it needed no explanation. Red flower, blood, poppies growing on graves, the dead made visible. the promise to remember. For the first time since the war began, Moina felt like she had done something that mattered, something real, not just paperwork, not just logistics, but something that honored the boys who had died. But as the soldiers filed out of her office, each wearing his small red flower, Moina realized something. This couldn't be a one-time gesture. This needed to be bigger, national. Every American should wear a poppy, every mother who lost a son, every widow who lost a husband, every person who wanted to say, "I remember, I will not forget." Moina Belle Michael had just found her life's mission. November 11th, 1918. The Armistice was signed. The war was over. But Moina's war was just beginning. For the next 2 years, she became a woman obsessed. She wrote letters to everyone she could think of. Veterans organizations, congressmen, newspaper editors, garden clubs, anyone who might listen to her idea. Make the poppy the official American symbol of remembrance. Most people ignored her. Those who responded did so politely, but dismissively. She was a middle-aged school teacher with an eccentric fixation on a flower. War heroes should be remembered with statues and monuments, not with garden flowers. Besides, the war was over. Time to move on, rebuild, look forward instead of dwelling on the past. But Moina didn't give up. She had made a promise to the dead, and the dead don't release you from your promises easily. She spoke to anyone who would listen. She gave talks at women's clubs, at church groups, at veterans gatherings. She told them about John McCrae's poem, about the red poppies growing in Flanders, about the power of a simple symbol to unite a nation in grief. Slowly, very slowly, people began to listen. In 1920, the American Legion held its national convention in Cleveland, Ohio. The Legion was the largest veterans organization in America. Hundreds of thousands of men who had served in the war and who now wielded significant political power. If Moina could convince them to adopt the poppy, she would have the backing she needed. She wasn't an official delegate. She had no invitation, but she went anyway, paying her own way, determined to make her case. On the day when the convention discussed what symbol the Legion should adopt to honor the war dead, Moina stood up during the open forum. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to speak clearly, projecting to the back of the room. "Gentlemen, I propose the poppy, the red poppy that grows in Flanders Fields, the poppy that Lieutenant Colonel McCrae wrote about in his poem. It's the perfect symbol. It grows on the graves of our dead. It's red, like the blood they shed. It's beautiful and delicate, like the lives that were cut short. And it's already known to every American who has read McCrae's poem." The room was silent. Then one veteran, an older man with a cane, stood up. "I was at Ypres," he said quietly. "I saw those poppies. They grew everywhere, on graves, in shell holes, places where nothing else would grow. The lady's right. It should be the poppy." Another stood. "I agree." Then another. On September 27th, 1920, the American Legion voted to adopt the poppy as its official memorial flower. Moina had won. She sat in that convention hall and wept. Not delicate, ladylike tears, but great, shuddering sobs of relief and grief and exhaustion. She had done it. She had kept her promise. But even as she celebrated, a practical problem emerged. The American Legion now officially endorsed the poppy. But where would they get millions of poppies? Who would make them? Who would distribute them? Moina didn't have an answer. Fortunately, someone else did. While Moina Belle Michael was fighting her campaign in America, across the Atlantic Ocean in France, another woman was having the exact same idea. Her name was Anna Guérin, though everyone called her Madame Guérin. She was a French schoolteacher and YMCA worker who had lost her husband in the war. Like millions of French women, she was now a widow, struggling to survive in a devastated country where entire regions had been reduced to rubble. Madame Guérin had also read in Flanders Fields, and she had also decided that the poppy should be the symbol of remembrance. But Madame Guérin was more practical than Moina. She wasn't interested in symbolic gestures or poetic promises. She was interested in survival. How do you help war widows and orphans? How do you rebuild a country when half your workforce is dead? Her solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Make artificial poppies and sell them. The widows and disabled veterans of France needed work. They needed income. Many of them could sew, could do handwork. Give them fabric and wire and instructions, and they could make flowers, beautiful flowers, flowers that could be sold to raise money for war relief. And the symbolism was perfect. War widows making poppies to honor the war dead. The living survivors supporting each other through the creation of symbols for the fallen. The circle complete. In 1920, Madame Guérin began organizing workshops across devastated regions of France. In Lille, in Arras, in Verdun, cities that had been on the front lines, cities where hardly a building remained standing, she gathered women together and taught them how to make artificial poppies from red fabric and black wire. The women worked in groups, sometimes in the ruins of buildings, sometimes in temporary shelters. They cut fabric, shaped petals, twisted wire, assembled flowers. And as they worked, they talked about their husbands, their sons, their brothers, about the men who weren't coming home, about how to survive in a world that had been turned upside down. Each poppy took about 10 minutes to make, and each poppy, when sold, provided a few francs to the woman who made it. Not much, but enough to buy bread, enough to keep going one more day. By late 1920, Madame Guérin's workshops were producing thousands of poppies a week. Now she needed markets. She needed countries that would buy them and distribute them. She had heard about Moina Belle Michael and the American Legion's adoption of the poppy. Perfect. America was rich, relatively untouched by the war, full of people who wanted to help European war relief, but didn't know how. In November 1920, Madame Guérin boarded a ship to America. Moina Belle Michael and Madame Anna Guérin met for the first time in New York City in late 1920. They were, in many ways, very different women. Moina was American, middle class, educated, idealistic. Anna was French, working class, practical, hardened by loss. Moina saw the poppy as a sacred symbol, a way to keep faith with the dead. Anna saw the poppy as a tool for survival, a way to help the living. But they understood each other immediately. They sat in a small office, speaking through an interpreter. Moina's French was poor, and within an hour they had mapped out a plan that would change the world. Madame Guérin would supply poppies made by French war widows. American veterans organizations would buy them and distribute them throughout the United States. The proceeds would support war relief in France, orphanages, hospitals, widow pensions. It was perfect. Remembrance combined with charity. The dead honored by helping the living survivors. Symbolism made practical. Moina introduced Madame Guérin to the American Legion leadership. They loved the idea. Here was a way to honor the dead, support French war relief, and give American veterans a visible mission. Everyone won. The American Legion placed an order for 9 million poppies. 9 million. Madame Guérin returned to France and mobilized her networks. Every war widow who could sew, every disabled veteran who could work with their hands, every orphanage and relief organization was brought into the effort. Workshops expanded, production increased. For months, in towns and cities across devastated France, women worked around the clock making red fabric flowers. Each poppy was marked with a small tag, made by the war widows of France. The poppies were shipped to America in enormous crates, crossing the Atlantic in the holds of cargo ships, arriving at ports in New York and Boston and Philadelphia, and from there they spread across the country. November 11th, 1921, the first official Poppy Day in the United States of America. The American Legion had vastly underestimated demand. Veterans posts across the country set up tables and began distributing poppies. They weren't selling them exactly. The poppy was supposed to be free, a gift. But they accepted donations, and the suggested donation was whatever you could afford. People lined up, hundreds of them, thousands. In New York, the line stretched for blocks. In Chicago, the Legion ran out of poppies by noon. In San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, every major city, the same story. Demand far exceeded supply. By evening of November 11th, 1921, virtually every poppy in America had been distributed, and millions of Americans went without because there simply weren't enough flowers to go around. But those who got poppies wore them proudly. Old men who had lost sons, young widows who had lost husbands, children who had lost fathers, and veterans themselves wearing the poppy to honor the men who hadn't come home. For one day, the entire country was united in visible grief. Strangers on the street, connected by a simple red flower pinned to their coats. A shared acknowledgement that something terrible had happened, that people they loved had died, that the war had cost more than anyone wanted to admit. It was the first time since the Armistice that Americans had been given permission to grieve collectively, and the response was overwhelming. Moina Belle Michael stood on a street corner in New York City that evening, watching people walk by wearing poppies. She was exhausted. She had been working non-stop for 3 years to make this happen. But in that moment, watching a nation remember, she felt something like peace. She had kept her promise. The torch had been passed. The dead would not be forgotten. But as Moina celebrated in New York, across the Atlantic Ocean, another country was watching. The country that had bled the most. The country that had lost nearly 1 million men. The country where John McCrae had written his poem. Britain had not yet adopted the poppy. Britain, in fact, still had no official day of remembrance, no ritual for honoring the dead. The government wanted the nation to move forward, to rebuild, to forget. But you cannot forget 886,000 ghosts. And one man was about to force the entire nation to stop, to be silent, and to remember. In 1919, Britain was a nation in shock, trying to pretend it wasn't. The war had been over for nearly a year. The troops had come home, those who were coming home at least. The factories had stopped making shells and started making civilian goods again. The government was focused on reconstruction, on economic recovery, on making sure the disruption of war didn't lead to revolution or collapse. Business as usual was the unofficial motto. Look forward, not back. The war was over. Time to move on. But the evidence of the war was everywhere, impossible to ignore. Every street had men in wheelchairs, men with empty sleeves pinned to their jackets, men with faces reconstructed by pioneering plastic surgery, faces that looked almost human, but not quite, faces that made children stare and adults look away, men who would start shaking when a car backfired, who couldn't sleep without nightmares, who would sit in corners of pubs and stare at nothing for hours. Every town had its roll of honour, a list of local men who had died, posted in the town square or in the church. In small villages, these lists could include every man of fighting age. Entire communities had lost an entire generation. There were villages where no men between 18 and 40 returned home. None. The lost generation, the newspapers called them, as if they had somehow wandered off and gotten misplaced, rather than been systematically slaughtered in the mud of France and Belgium. And everywhere there were the women, war widows, mothers who had lost sons, fiancés whose marriages would never happen, sisters who had lost brothers. These women wore black, as tradition demanded. But how long should they wear black? A year? 5 years? Forever? The streets of London, of Manchester, of Glasgow were full of women in mourning dress. The entire nation looked like it was attending a funeral that never ended. But there was no official acknowledgement, no national day of mourning, no ritual for collective grief. The government, terrified of the psychological toll, afraid that encouraging public displays of grief would demoralize the nation, simply avoided the issue. Individual families buried their dead, held private services, mourned in isolation. But there was no space for national grief, no permission to mourn together. The British people needed something, some way to mark their loss, some ritual that would allow them to grieve without falling apart completely. And then, in late 1919, a man proposed an idea so simple, so perfect, that it's remarkable no one had thought of it before. 2 minutes of silence. Sir Percy Fitzpatrick was a South African journalist living in London. He had served in the South African War at the turn of the century and had seen how South African troops had marked the anniversary of a major battle, with a few minutes of complete silence, a pause to remember the dead. The idea was simple. At a specific time, on a specific day, the entire nation would stop. Stop working, stop talking, stop moving. For 2 minutes, complete and total stillness. Time to think about the dead, time to remember, and then, after 2 minutes, return to life. Fitzpatrick proposed the idea to King George V, suggesting that Britain observe 2 minutes of silence on the anniversary of the Armistice, November 11th, at 11 a.m., the exact moment the guns had stopped. The king loved it. He immediately proclaimed that the United Kingdom would observe this ritual. November 11th, 1919, would be the first National Day of Remembrance. The response from the public was immediate and overwhelming. Finally, someone was acknowledging what they had all been feeling. Finally, there was permission to stop, to pause, to remember. But there was also anxiety. Would people actually observe it? Would the whole country really stop for 2 minutes? Or would it be embarrassing, a few people standing still while everyone else ignored it? November 11th, 1919, 10:55 a.m. Across Britain, people began preparing. In London, buses and trams started pulling over to the side of the road. In factories, foremen announced that at 11 o'clock, all machinery would stop. In schools, teachers told students to stand by their desks. In homes, families gathered in living rooms. 11 a.m. Big Ben struck 11 times. The sound echoed across London, and then silence. It's almost impossible to describe what those 2 minutes felt like. In London, every vehicle stopped. Buses, trams, cars, horse-drawn carriages. Everything pulled to the side of the road and stopped. People got out of vehicles and stood on the pavement. Pedestrians froze mid-step. Shopkeepers came out of their shops and stood in doorways. Piccadilly Circus, normally one of the busiest intersections in the world, was completely still. Thousands of people standing motionless, looking at the ground or at the sky or at nothing. In factories, the machinery stopped. The constant noise of industrial Britain, the hammering, the grinding, the hissing of steam, fell silent. Workers stood by their stations, caps in hands, heads bowed. On the London Stock Exchange, trading stopped mid-transaction. Men in suits stood at their desks, papers in hand, frozen. Trains stopped on the tracks. Passengers stood in their compartments. Conductors stood on platforms. In schools, children stood by their desks, instructed to think about fathers and brothers who hadn't come home. Some of them were too young to remember the men they were mourning, but they understood that something important was happening. And in homes across the country, families stood in their living rooms or kitchens, thinking about empty chairs at the dinner table. The silence was absolute. You could hear the wind. You could hear birds, sparrows, pigeons, starlings, going about their business, oblivious to the human ritual below. You could hear the sound of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, and if you listened very carefully, you could hear people crying, not loud, theatrical crying, quiet weeping. The sound of grief that had been held in for too long finally being released. Old men, hardened by war, standing on street corners with tears running down their faces. Young widows, clutching photographs of husbands they would never see again. Mothers, mourning sons who had been 19, 20, 21 years old when they died. For 2 minutes, Britain allowed itself to feel, and then, at 11:02, church bells began to ring. Life resumed. Buses started moving. Factories restarted their machines. People went back to work, back to school, back to the business of living. But something had changed. The nation had paused, together to acknowledge its loss. The dead had been remembered, and there was a strange sense of relief, as if a pressure that had been building for months had finally been released. The 2-minute silence would become an annual tradition, observed every November 11th for the next century and counting, and in 1921 it would gain a companion ritual, the poppy. In late 1921, fresh from her success in America, Madame Anna Guérin arrived in Britain. She went directly to the British Legion, the United Kingdom's largest veterans organisation, with her proposal. French war widows would make artificial poppies. The British Legion would distribute them across Britain on November 11th, the day of the 2-minute silence. People would buy poppies and wear them as a visible symbol of remembrance. The money raised would support British war veterans and their families. The British Legion immediately understood the power of this idea. The 2-minute silence was profound, but it was temporary. It lasted 2 minutes and then it was gone. The poppy would be permanent, or at least would last all day. A visible marker of remembrance that people could wear, that strangers could see and recognize. The Legion ordered 9 million poppies from Madame Guérin's French workshops, but they underestimated, just as the Americans had. November 11th, 1921, the first British poppy appeal. The demand was staggering. Distribution points were set up across Britain, outside train stations, in town squares, at churches, in shopping districts. British Legion volunteers stood with boxes of poppies, offering them to passers-by in exchange for donations. The poppies sold out in hours. By mid-morning in London, most distribution points were empty. Desperate volunteers telephoned Legion headquarters. "We need more poppies." Hundreds of people are still asking, but there were no more. 9 million had seemed like an impossibly large number, but Britain's population was 44 million, and it seemed like every single person wanted a poppy. Those who got poppies wore them proudly, pinned to coats, to hats, to dresses, a small red flower over the heart. Rich and poor, old and young, men and women, everyone wore them. At 11 a.m., the 2-minute silence was observed. And this year, for the first time, the people standing in silence were wearing red flowers, as if the poppies from Flanders Fields had been transplanted to the streets of Britain, as if the dead had sent a message marked in red that they remembered. The British Legion counted the donations at the end of the day. They had raised over £106,000, an enormous sum in 1921, equivalent to millions today. The money would fund veteran housing, disability support, widow pensions, orphanages for children whose fathers had died in the war. But more importantly, the poppy had given the British people what they desperately needed. A way to remember that was both personal and public. You bought your own poppy, wore it for your own reasons, remembered your own dead, but you did it alongside millions of others, and that act of collective remembrance made it bearable. The poppy was no longer just a flower, it was a ritual, a tradition, a visible thread connecting the living to the dead. But Britain faced the same problem America had. Where would they get enough poppies for next year? Major George Howson had come home from the war a broken man. He had been a promising young officer, brave and capable, but a German shell had left him partially deaf, his hands permanently shaking from what they called shell shock, but what we would now recognize as severe PTSD. He couldn't return to his pre-war career. Most employers took one look at his trembling hands and shaking demeanor and politely showed him the door. He was not alone. Hundreds of thousands of British veterans had returned home wounded, disabled, unable to work. There were programs for them, some government support, but it was inadequate. Many veterans ended up begging on street corners, selling matches or shoelaces, trying to survive on charity. Howson had an idea. These men could work, if given work suited to their abilities. Something that didn't require heavy labor or fine motor skills. Something that could be done seated, at a reasonable pace, with frequent breaks. Something like making artificial flowers. In 1922, Major George Howson founded the Poppy Factory in Richmond, southwest London. It was staffed entirely by disabled veterans, men who had lost limbs or their sight or their hearing, men with shell shock, with chronic pain, with psychological wounds that would never fully heal. Men who needed work, needed purpose, needed to feel useful again. The factory was set up to be accommodating. Workstations were adjustable for wheelchairs. Schedules were flexible. Supervisors were trained to recognize when someone was having a bad day and needed to step away. It wasn't charity. The men were paid for their work, but it was compassionate employment, something almost unheard of in the early 1920s. And the work they did was meaningful. Every poppy they made honored their dead comrades. The veterans who made the poppies had been there, in Flanders and the Somme and Passchendaele. They had seen the poppies growing on battlefields. Some of them had buried friends under those flowers. Now they were bringing the poppies home, making them by hand, ensuring that Britain would never run out again. The symbolism was perfect. Veterans making poppies to honour the fallen, while supporting themselves through their labour. The living and the dead, connected through a flower. By 1926, the poppy factory was producing millions of poppies annually. It became self-sustaining, a successful business that provided employment for disabled veterans while fulfilling a national need. And remarkably, the poppy factory is still operating today, over a century later, still employing disabled veterans, still making poppies by hand, still honouring the dead while helping the living. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the November rituals became fixed in British culture. Remembrance Sunday was established, the Sunday closest to November 11th. This allowed for larger ceremonies than a weekday observance. The main ceremony took place at the Cenotaph in Whitehall, London. A massive stone monument unveiled in 1920, inscribed with the words, "The Glorious Dead." Every year, the King, later the Queen, would attend. The Prime Minister, foreign dignitaries, veterans' organisations would parade, and at exactly 11 a.m., the 2-minute silence would be observed. The ceremony followed a precise ritual. 10:59, the King or Queen would arrive and take position at the Cenotaph 11. Big Ben would strike. Cannon would fire to signal the start of silence. 11 o'clock to 11 o'clock 2, complete silence. Heads bowed, eyes closed or fixed on the ground. 11:02, cannon would fire again, ending the silence. A bugler would play "The Last Post," the traditional military funeral call. The King would lay a wreath of poppies at the base of the cenotaph. Other dignitaries would follow, each laying wreaths. Veterans would march past in formation. Church bells would ring, and everyone, from the King to the poorest veteran, wore a poppy. The ritual spread through the British Empire and Commonwealth. Canada, where John McCrae had written his poem, adopted it enthusiastically. Australia and New Zealand, which had lost proportionally even more men than Britain, embraced it. South Africa, India, all the nations that had sent men to die in a European war, created their own versions of the ceremony. The poppy became more than a British symbol. It became the Commonwealth's shared language of grief. But even as the tradition solidified, cracks were beginning to appear. In 1926, just 5 years after the red poppy was first distributed in Britain, a group of women created an alternative. The Cooperative Women's Guild, a left-wing women's organisation, announced that they would be selling white poppies alongside the red ones. The white poppy, they said, represented peace and a commitment to preventing future wars, rather than honouring military service. The reaction was immediate and furious. The British Legion denounced the white poppy as an insult to the war dead. Veterans accused the Women's Guild of pacifist propaganda, of betraying the men who had died. Newspapers ran editorials condemning the white poppy as unpatriotic, but the Women's Guild refused to back down. Their argument was simple. The red poppy had become associated with military valor and the nobility of sacrifice. It was being used, they argued, to glorify war rather than to mourn its victims. Wearing a red poppy was increasingly seen as supporting the military, supporting potential future wars. The white poppy, they said, honored all victims of war, soldiers and civilians, British and German, while also committing the wearer to preventing future conflicts. Never again should mean never again, not never again unless we think the cause is just. The debate grew heated. At its core was a fundamental question: what does remembrance mean? Is remembering the dead about honoring their sacrifice? Or is it about learning from their deaths? Should we remember so that we can be worthy of their sacrifice? Or should we remember so that we never repeat the mistakes that led to their deaths? The red poppy and the white poppy represented two different answers to that question, and the British public was divided. Most people wore red. The white poppy remained a minority symbol, worn primarily by pacifists and left-wing activists. But its existence meant that the red poppy was no longer unquestionably universal. There was now an alternative, and choosing between them was a political statement. The simple symbol of grief had become a symbol of division, and that division would only grow more complicated in the decades to come, as new wars brought new names to remember, and as the meaning of the poppy was pulled in directions that John McCrae could never have imagined. September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland. 21 years. That's how long the peace had lasted. One generation, just long enough for the boys who had been born during World War I to grow up and become soldiers themselves. The mothers who had worn poppies in the 1920s to mourn their husbands were now pinning poppies on their coats while their sons marched off to war. The veterans who had survived the trenches of the Somme were now watching their children head to the beaches of Dunkirk, the deserts of North Africa, the skies above Britain. The bitter irony was crushing. The war to end all wars had failed. The poppies that were supposed to honor the dead and prevent future conflicts had watched helplessly as humanity prepared to destroy itself all over again. On November 11th, 1939, Britain observed Remembrance Day as usual. The 2-minute silence, the ceremony at the Cenotaph, the poppies worn on every coat. But this year, the ritual felt different, hollow almost. They were remembering the dead of the last war while already fighting the next one. The poppies in 1939 honoured the 886,000 British dead of World War I, but everyone knew that by next year's Remembrance Day, there would be new dead to mourn. How do you remember the last war when you're fighting the current one? What does never again mean when again is happening right now? The poppy was supposed to be a promise, but the promise had been broken. November 11th, 1940. London. The Blitz was in full swing. German bombers came every night, dropping tons of high explosives and incendiaries on the city. Buildings collapsed. Fires raged. Londoners slept in underground stations, hundreds of feet below ground, while the city above them burned. But on November 11th, at 11 a.m., life stopped. Air raid sirens were silent for those 2 minutes. If German bombers had come during the silence, they would have found the entire city standing still, defenseless, observing a ritual for the dead of the last war while waiting to become the dead of the current one. It was an act of defiance and faith, a refusal to let the war destroy everything, even ritual, even memory. The living paused to honor the dead of 1914 to 1918, even as they knew they might join those dead by nightfall. And everyone wore poppies, red flowers on coats covered in dust from collapsed buildings, red flowers on the uniforms of soldiers about to ship out, red flowers on the dresses of women who worked in munitions factories, making bombs to drop on German cities, the same kind of bombs that were falling on London. The poppy in wartime took on a strange dual meaning. It honored past sacrifice while also implicitly sanctioning current sacrifice. If the dead of the last war were heroes worthy of remembrance, then surely the soldiers fighting now were heroes too. The poppy became a bridge between wars, connecting the honored dead of 1918 with the soon-to-be dead of 1945. For 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, the poppy served this dual purpose, looking backward and forward simultaneously, honoring the last war while justifying the current one. And then, in 1945, World War II ended. The final death toll, approximately 85 million people, 10 times the casualties of World War I, an entire order of magnitude more dead. Now the poppy had to remember 2 world wars, and the question became, is one flower enough? After 1945, the poppy's meaning had to expand. November 11th could no longer be just about World War I. It had to encompass World War II as well. The ceremony at the Cenotaph now honored both wars. The 2 minutes of silence remembered millions more dead, but they didn't create a new symbol. The poppy would suffice for both. In fact, the poppy would remember all wars, past, present, and future. Remembrance Day became less about a specific war and more about war in general. The poppy became the universal symbol for military sacrifice, for all soldiers who had died in all conflicts. This expansion made sense practically. You can't create a new flower for every war. But it also diluted the poppy's meaning. When a symbol means everything, does it mean anything? John McCrae had written about specific poppies growing on specific graves in Flanders in 1915. The flower had been tied to a particular place, a particular moment, a particular horror. But now the poppy was being asked to represent conflicts in Burma, in the Pacific, in the deserts of North Africa, in places where poppies didn't even grow. The symbol was stretching, becoming more abstract, losing some of its concrete power. But that was only the beginning, because the wars didn't stop in 1945. 1950, the Korean War. 1955 to 1975, the Vietnam War. 1956, the Suez Crisis. 1982, the Falklands War. 1991, the Gulf War. 2001 to 2021, Afghanistan. 2003 to 2011, Iraq. Each new conflict added more names to the list of the dead, and each time the poppy was expected to stretch a little further, to accommodate one more war. But some of these wars were complicated. World War I and World War II, despite their horrors, had clear narratives in the public mind. Britain and its allies fought against aggressor nations. The cause was just, or at least defensible. The dead had died for freedom, for civilization, for the survival of the nation. But Vietnam, that was America's war, not Britain's. But Britain watched as thousands of young Americans died in a conflict that seemed pointless, unwinnable, wrong. Could the poppy honor those dead? Should it? The Falklands, a war over a remote island that most Britons couldn't locate on a map before the conflict started. Young men died for what, exactly? National pride? Principle? Were those deaths worthy of the same remembrance as the men who died stopping Hitler? Iraq and Afghanistan. Wars based on questionable intelligence, fought for unclear objectives, ending in failure and withdrawal. Could the poppy honor soldiers who died in wars that many believed shouldn't have been fought? These questions created tension that had always been latent in the poppy, but was now becoming explicit. Does wearing a poppy mean supporting current military actions, or does it only mean honoring past dead? The answer depended on who you asked.
By the 2000s, the poppy had become a battlefield in Britain's culture wars. Every November, a ritual began that had nothing to do with honouring the dead, and everything to do with performing patriotism. Television presenters who appeared on air without wearing a poppy would face immediate backlash. Social media would erupt with accusations of disrespect, of betraying the troops, of dishonouring sacrifice. Why isn't she wearing a poppy? Doesn't she support our soldiers? The BBC issued guidelines to its presenters. Wearing a poppy was encouraged but not mandatory. This, of course, led to more controversy. If it's not mandatory, does that mean some presenters don't care about the war dead? Football, soccer, became a flashpoint. FIFA, football's international governing body, banned players from wearing poppies on their jerseys during matches, citing rules against political symbols. Britain erupted in outrage. The poppy isn't political, it's about remembrance. But was it? If everyone is expected to wear one, if not wearing one is seen as a political statement, then wearing one is also political, isn't it? The poppy had become a loyalty test, a way to separate us, those who properly honour the dead, from them, those who don't. Critics began using the term poppy fascism, the aggressive enforcement of poppy wearing, the shaming of those who chose not to participate, the transformation of a voluntary symbol into a mandatory performance of patriotism. Defenders responded, "This isn't fascism, it's respect. The men who died deserve to be honoured. If you won't spend £2 on a poppy and 2 minutes standing in silence, what does that say about you?" Both sides had a point, and neither could hear the other over the shouting. The worst moment came when far-right groups began appropriating the poppy. White nationalist organisations started using poppy imagery in their propaganda. Anti-immigrant groups wore poppies prominently while marching with signs about keeping Britain British. The poppy, a symbol that was supposed to transcend politics, was being weaponized as a nationalist symbol. World War II veterans, actual men who had fought fascism in the 1940s, spoke out in horror. "This isn't what we fought for," they said. "We didn't die to give these people a symbol for their hatred." But the genie was out of the bottle. The poppy had become so ubiquitous, so mandatory, that it could be used by anyone for any purpose. And there was no central authority that could say, "You're using it wrong." Moina Belle Michael, who had bought 25 silk flowers in 1918 to honour the dead, probably never imagined that her symbol would one day be carried at far-right rallies. John McCrae, who had written his poem as a howl of grief for his dead friend, probably never imagined that his flowers would become political weapons. But symbols, once released into the world, take on lives of their own. They mean what people make them mean, and different people make them mean different things. Today, in the 2020s, the poppy exists in a state of fracture. For many people, it still means what it always meant: personal remembrance. A grandfather who died at the Somme, a father who didn't come home from Normandy, an uncle killed in Afghanistan. The poppy is about specific people, specific losses, specific grief. For others, it has become a political symbol, whether they like it or not. Wearing a red poppy signals support for the military, for current wars, for a particular vision of British identity. Not wearing one signals opposition to those things, or at least ambivalence. The white poppy still exists, worn by pacifists and anti-war activists. Now there are also purple poppies, honouring animals who died in war, and black poppies, honouring African, Caribbean, and Pacific Islander contributions that have been historically overlooked. Each poppy colour represents a different community claiming the symbol, adapting it to their own needs and meanings. Is this fragmentation, or is it evolution? Perhaps both. But here's what hasn't changed. Every November, people still buy poppies. Millions of them. They pin them to their coats and wear them for a week or two. And on November 11th, at 11 a.m., they stand in silence. And in those 2 minutes, away from the cameras and the controversies and the culture wars, people think about the dead. A woman stands in a cemetery, looking at her grandfather's headstone. He died in 1916 at the Somme. She never met him, but she wears his poppy anyway. A veteran of the Falklands War stands in his living room, thinking about the men from his unit who didn't come home. The war was 40 years ago. He still dreams about them. A young person, barely 20, thinks about a friend who deployed to Afghanistan and came back changed. Not dead, but not alive either. Not in the way he used to be. The poppy is for him too. In these moments, the poppy works. It connects the living to the dead. It says, I remember. I will not forget. The politics fall away. The arguments about what the poppy really means become irrelevant. Because in the end, remembrance is personal before it's public. You wear a poppy for your reasons, and those reasons are valid, whatever they are. If you go to Flanders today, you can visit the battlefields. They're peaceful now, farmland mostly. The Belgians have reclaimed the landscape, ploughing over trenches, filling in craters, planting crops where men once died by the thousands. It's green and quiet and beautiful. But there are preserved sections, places where you can walk into reconstructed trenches and try to imagine what it was like. The trenches are clean now, reinforced with concrete, safe for tourists. Not like the real trenches, which were full of mud and rats and the smell of death. You can visit the cemeteries. There are hundreds of them scattered across Belgium and France. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains them impeccably. Endless rows of white headstones, each marking a grave, each inscribed with a name, if the body was identified, a rank, a regiment, sometimes a personal inscription chosen by the family. He died that we might live, forever in our hearts. Gone, but not forgotten. Thousands and thousands of headstones. Tens of thousands, each one representing a life cut short, a family destroyed, a future that never happened. And yes, in the spring, poppies still grow there. Not as thick as they did during the war. The soil isn't churned by shells anymore. The lime has been washed away by a century of rain. But they're there, wild poppies, red as blood, growing between the headstones, just like McCrae described. The earth remembers, even if we forget. There's a specific cemetery you should know about. It's called Essex Farm Cemetery, and it's right next to the canal bank where John McCrae's dressing station was located. The concrete bunkers are still there. You can go inside, stand where McCrae stood, look out at the cemetery where he buried his friend. The bunkers are small, cramped, dark, even in daylight. It's hard to imagine performing surgery in there by candlelight, while shells exploded overhead. The cemetery is next to the bunkers. It's not large, about 1,200 graves. Alexis Helmer is not buried there anymore. His body was later moved to a larger cemetery nearby. But the graves that are there are meticulously maintained, each white headstone identical, each marking a Commonwealth soldier. And in the spring, red poppies grow. On the graves, along the paths, in the spaces between headstones. Wild poppies, growing where they've grown for centuries, where they grew in 1915 when McCrae looked out and saw them covering the battlefield. If you stand in that cemetery on a quiet spring morning, you can almost understand what McCrae felt. The contrast between the silent graves and the living flowers. The way nature insists on itself even in the presence of death. The terrible beauty of it. But you can only almost understand. Because you're standing there in peace, surrounded by tourists with cameras, knowing you'll leave in an hour and go have lunch somewhere nice. McCrae stood there knowing he would go back into the bunker and try to save the next dying boy, and the next, until his own body gave out. The gap between tourism and lived experience is unbridgeable. We can visit the battlefield, but we can't know the war. All we can do is remember, and the poppy helps us remember. Let's return to where this all began, to the 15 lines that changed everything. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. This poem has been analysed, interpreted, argued over for more than a century. People have found all sorts of meanings in it. Some see it as a call to war, a demand that the living continue fighting. Others see it as a warning, a cry from the dead that their sacrifice shouldn't be repeated. But here's what the poem actually is. It's grief. It's a man standing at his friend's grave, trying to make sense of senseless death, trying to find some meaning in the horror he's witnessing. The poppies are just what he saw. The take up our quarrel line is just what people believed in 1915, that the war was necessary, that the dead had died for a reason, that their sacrifice shouldn't be in vain. McCrae wasn't writing propaganda. He wasn't trying to recruit more soldiers or justify the war. He was writing about what he saw and what he felt in a moment of exhausted grief. Everything else, the global movement, the millions of poppies, the political arguments, the culture wars. We added all of that McCrae just wrote about a flower on a grave. And maybe that's the most important thing to remember about the poppy. At its core, before all the politics and controversy, it's just a flower on a grave, a marker of loss, a way of saying, someone I loved was here, and now they're not. That's all it needs to be. Strip away all the controversy. Forget the debates about red versus white poppies, about whether wearing one is mandatory or political or meaningful. Forget the culture wars and the virtue signalling and the accusations of poppy fascism. What's left? A flower. Red petals around a black center. Simple, beautiful, delicate. And a promise. I will remember. That's the core of it. Everything else is noise. You don't have to wear a poppy if you don't want to. Remembrance can't be forced, can't be mandated, can't be turned into a loyalty test. Genuine grief and genuine memory are private things, and they don't require public performance. But if you do choose to wear one, know what it originally meant. It meant someone I cared about died, and I'm going to make sure they're not forgotten. That's all. One person remembering another person. Multiplied by millions, yes, but still fundamentally personal, individual, specific, not abstract sacrifice, not political statements, not nationalism or militarism or any of the things the poppy has been accused of representing. Just, I knew someone who died, or my family knew someone, or I want to honor people I never knew but who gave their lives in ways I can't fully comprehend. I will remember. That's the promise. And it's a promise worth keeping. Every year, the ritual repeats. In Britain, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, across the Commonwealth, at 11 a.m. on November 11th, or the nearest Sunday, people stop. 2 minutes of silence. Some bow their heads. Some close their eyes. Some stare at the ground or at the sky. Some think about specific people, grandfathers, fathers, brothers, friends. Some think about war in general, about the cost of conflict, about the debt owed to those who served. Some wear red poppies, some wear white, some wear purple or black, some wear nothing at all. But for 2 minutes, they remember. And in cemeteries across Belgium and France, red poppies grow. They grow on the graves of British soldiers and Canadian soldiers and Australian soldiers. They grow on the graves of German soldiers too, because poppies don't recognize national boundaries. They grow in the spring, when the earth warms and the rain comes, and the seeds that have been waiting underground finally get their chance to bloom. They grow where blood soaked into the soil a century ago. They grow where young men died calling for their mothers. They grow where John McCrae stood in 1915 and tried to find words for grief. And every spring, they bloom again, red as blood, red as remembrance, indifferent to politics and arguments and the passage of time, just flowers, just poppies, growing in Flanders Fields. Let us return one last time to that morning in May 1915. John McCrae stands in the grey dawn, looking at red flowers growing on his friend's grave. He's exhausted. He's covered in blood. Alexis Helmer's blood. The blood of dozens of other boys he tried and failed to save. He hasn't slept in 36 hours. Behind him, the war continues. The guns never stop. More wounded are arriving. More boys are dying. The horror is endless. But in front of him, impossibly, are these flowers. bright red against grey mud, life insisting on itself in the presence of death. It's beautiful and terrible at the same time. And McCrae understands, in that moment, that this is what he needs to write about. Not the strategy of the war, not the politics, not the grand sweep of history. Just this, a flower growing on a grave, the juxtaposition of beauty and horror, the way nature continues regardless of what humans do to each other. In 20 minutes, he'll write the poem that will make him immortal. But right now, in this moment, he's just a man looking at flowers and thinking about his dead friend. That's where it all began. Not with movements or traditions or political symbols, just with grief and a flower, and the simple human need to mark loss in a way that makes it bearable. Everything else, the millions of paper poppies, the ceremonies at the Cenotaph, the 2 minutes of silence, the debates about what it all means, came later. In the beginning, it was just a doctor and a flower and a friend who wasn't coming home, and maybe that's all it ever needed to be. This was the story of the poppy, from a flower growing wild on a battlefield in Belgium, to a poem written in 20 minutes by an exhausted doctor, to a global symbol of remembrance worn by millions. From Moina Belle Michael buying 25 silk flowers in a New York YMCA, to Madame Anna Guérin organizing French war widows to make millions more, to Major George Howson creating a factory that still employs disabled veterans a century later. From the simple ritual of 2 minutes of silence, to the ceremony at the Cenotaph, to the controversies about what the poppy means in our modern, complicated world. The poppy has carried the weight of over a century of war and memory. It has been a symbol of grief, of honor, of peace, of politics, of division, of unity. It has meant different things to different people, and it continues to evolve. But at its core, the poppy is still what it was in 1915, a flower growing on a grave, a marker of loss, a way of saying, I remember. And every November, in fields and cemeteries across Europe, the wild poppies still bloom, red as blood, red as remembrance. They grow where the dead are buried. They grow where McCrae stood and wrote his poem. They grow where millions of young men took their last breaths. And they remind us every spring that the earth remembers what we try to forget. What does the poppy mean to you? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, if it made you think about remembrance in a new way, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We explore the forgotten legends, the dark histories, and the real stories behind the symbols that shape our world. This Remembrance Sunday, whatever you choose to wear or not wear, whatever your feelings about war and memory and the poppy's complicated meanings, take 2 minutes. Stand still. Be silent. And think about the fact that every war casualty was someone's son, someone's friend, someone's love, someone who saw poppies growing in the mud and wondered if they'd ever see home again. Lest we forget. Keep the candle lit.